And with the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right. Tonight, like I said, we are going to be looking at basically the fall, the end times of the nation or the kingdom of Israel, and then next week, of course, we'll carry on with another 100 years of the kingdom of Judah. As you know, kingdom actually, it would be a vassal state, the Assyrian Empire at that point. And here's our ever-present map showing the divided kingdom that's even further divided now, and showing this is before the Assyrian army comes down in here and captures all of Israel, and they go down in here and actually in regular history, they come down here into the they call it Philistia, the Philistine states, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and down there, and even Gaza, and they capture that too. So eventually, the Assyrian Empire comes all the way down through the area of Israel and into Egypt and capture part of Egypt also. So it was quite large and quite a big thing for the Assyrians to come down. No one could really stand in their way at that point. Here's our map, and this is where we're going to be tonight, talking about a little bit of Jotham and Pekah and Pekah, Hoshea and Ahaz. All right, and so we're going to stop off at Hoshea, because that's the end of the kingdom of Israel, and then we're stopping off at Ahaz, because then that's a good jumping off spot for the next week. We'll be studying Hezekiah, and so. All right, tonight, like I said, we're looking at, and here's a map of just the various campaigns of the Assyrians against Israel. And it's one of these kind of things that you have to be a real map and history nerd to look at this and try to figure out all of the different arrows where they went and so forth. And so I did all of that earlier, looking at that, because I am a map and a history nerd, and so I thought it was quite interesting. But anyway, I put that in there so that you could look at that. And so let me go ahead and get started here. In order to understand the success of the Assyrian military machine, like I said, man, they went through just like hot knife through butter. And you got to understand how the concept of warfare, it pervaded the Assyrian culture. I mean, it was part of their culture, their religion. Their religion was a religion of warfare, and so they required all adult males to be conscripted into the army. And they had a permanent standing army during this particular time in history. Earlier they did not, but now with the coming of Tiglath-pileser the third, that's called the Neo-Assyrian period. Then they started having the standing army. And generally speaking, countries did not have standing armies back in those days. When something would happen, they would call up everybody, and all the farmers would have to put down their hoes and plowshares and pick up their hoe and stick or whatever it was that they were going to go to battle with. But the Assyrians were some of the first to actually have a standing army and they gave their army weapons that were actually made for war. swords and spears and bows and arrows and things like that. They were specifically designed for war and not dual purpose of maybe hunting or uh, you know whatever they would be doing in their agricultural business. And so the captain, or the commander in chief of the Assyrian army, was actually the king, and he fought side by side right in the front lines with the troops. And that was, again, something that a lot of these countries did not do. Their captain, or their king, would be sitting up on the hillside looking over and directing things, but he was not going to be in the thick of the battle. And so the Assyrians, though, did that. Their leader was right there at the front. He was the one leading the charge. And they think that possibly the death of Sargon II there at Samaria may have been as a result of a skirmish with the Samaritans. So and it was also Sargon II who restructured the Assyrian state internally, and he went to war. He campaigned just about every year. He would go out to war just about every year, and so he kept building up more and more territories, and so all of his important positions within the government were also military posts, so that the person that was their minister of this and that and the other, whatever it would have been, it was going to be a military man, because then that way he had much better control over them. And so the military people then would be right alongside with any nobility that there were, that if they would capture somebody and a country, well, then they would put a military guy right there alongside them. So they their whole martial foundations, their military foundations, can be traced really clearly to their religion. They followed a polytheistic religion, meaning they had many gods, and well, which was not unusual. Most of the people of the ancient Near East were like that. They had look at what Egypt did. Where they had a god for this and a god for that and a god for the other things, and they covered all their bases. And really, that's what when the God of Israel went through and had all the plagues in Egypt, that was a direct affront to each one of those gods that Egypt had. And so he was showing that he was more powerful than any of the Egyptian deities. And so the Assyrians did not believe that their king was a god, like some countries would do, and some kings would say, I am a son of God, or I am a god, or whatever. No, they didn't believe that. They just believed that he was appointed by the gods as the king of the universe. And so he was expected to fulfill the duties of a high priest by conducting the proper purification rituals, making sure that all the omens and everything were right. And then he would base his decision to go to war on the interpretation of the omens. Now, although the Assyrians worshipped many deities, there were three who received most of the attention: Ashur, Shamash, and Ishtar. Now, all three deities contained military or martial aspects in their personalities. And so, Ashur was the patron of their capital city. Shamash was a sun god. And it was Ishtar who was the primary Assyrian war deity. Now, that's a little strange in that, Ishtar was also the in their mythology, she was the female consort of Shamash, and her primary abilities and attributes, though she was the goddess of love, fertility, and war. And in whatever order that might be. And so the Assyrians believed that in order for their lands to be productive, and they had to conduct warfare relentlessly for Ishtar. So they were always going out and conquering for their deity Ishtar. And so there's omens out there that reveal how important it was for them. And this this one here's, I'll just read this one here, and you can, it reads kind of like, in many ways, kind of like the Song of Solomon in a way. During the night in which I appeared before her, a seer reclined and saw a dream. When he awoke, Ishtar showed him a night vision. Eat food, drink wine, supply music, praise my divinity while I go and do that work in order that you attain your heart's desire. Your face or your face need not become pale, nor your feet become exhausted, nor your strength come to naught in the onslaught of battle. In her loving bosom, she embraced you and protected your whole figure. Before her, a fire was then burning. Before her, a fire was then burning. To the conquest of your enemies, she will march forth at your side. So that was, kind of one of those omen things that they talk about, and they would fire people up before they would go to war. And so with Ishtar by their side, the Assyrians then they would overcome any incredible, just all sorts of incredible odds. Because that was their religion. Now they also had some technological advances. Now we look at it and say, okay, technology, yeah, right. But they had deployed some new military innovations and techniques. Okay, now I just had a picture of, you look at these and you say, well, wait a minute, what's so big? What's the big deal about that? Well, if you look at the way warfare was conducted back in those days, some of the relief pictures or things that the stone reliefs that they found showed that during the reign of Tiglath-pileser III, that they had wheeled siege weapons at the walls of fortified cities, being used with a lever away at that used to lever away at the fortification of the town, some kind of a catapult kind of a thing. And they were covered with leather so that they would protect them. And unfortunately, though, all you can see is maybe a little bit of a hint in the relief carvings, but that because they were made out of wood and so forth, none of that has survived. 3,500 years, something like that, 2,500 years. So now, and besides introducing the new siege weapons to the battlefield, the Assyrians were also some of the very first people to employ cavalry. Now we think cavalry, of course, is old hat now, but before the Iron Age, they would have the chariots were the gold standard for armies. That was a big deal. If you had chariots, then you were the big dog on the street there. And then once you got chariots with iron wheels, covering your wheels and kind of protecting them, rather than bronze, then that was a step up. And but they used chariots because the horses at that time, they had not bred the horses up to a sufficient size to carry a warrior with armor and stuff like that. So they could use a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 horses pulling a chariot, and these were a little bit smaller horses actually, but then once they bred them up to be a substantial size, then they developed the cavalry. Of course, with cavalry you have a completely different tactics. Remember that there were times when Israel fought against nations that had chariots. And what did they do? They would go up into the hills and the rocks, and the chariots couldn't follow that because they needed roads or flat land. And then another time they got the chariots to follow Israel, and then guess what? There was a big swamp in the middle, and the chariots all got bogged down. And so then these guys were sitting ducks, and Israel was able to prevail in that battle. And so with the idea of having horses not tethered to a chariot, these people were able to circumvent a lot of the problems that came up with chariots. And then of course then they learned how to shoot their bows from the back of a horse, and that made them a pretty formidable opponent in the battlefield. They could be much more they could move much quicker and were much more maneuverable than the chariots. So they were the Assyrians were right there at the vanguard of this transition from chariots into cavalry. And so anyone that was still using chariots back in those days, well, you were behind the curve, as it were. So then there was another, this over here you'll see on the right, the idea of having your archers in a team with the archer and a shield man right there beside him, which would protect the archer somewhat. And especially if you got a shield man on either side, then he's shooting between the two shields, and it protected the archer a good bit. So anyway, that was another thing that they did. And probably the biggest deal about the Assyrian military was that that they were brutal, absolutely brutal. In the way that they were going against everybody. So actually, if you were to say they were brutal, that's an understatement, because their brutality was systematic. It was clinical. I mean, they had perfected terrorism and brutality on the battlefield, and then even off. So they would sometimes, the enemy would just see that, oh, you're Assyrians, we give up. That's it. We stop. We're not even going to think about fighting you. And as long as you paid your dues, your tribute, then you could get along. But the instant that anyone gave them any kind of pushback, then the response was very overwhelming, and the have a bit of problem with going through a city and killing, just systematically torturing, raping, beheading, and so forth. There was one kingdom north of Assyria that is called Kadmuhu, and they decided they were not going to give their allegiance to the Assyrian king. So he was eventually their king. The king of Kadmuhu was eventually captured by the Assyrians, and he was flayed alive. Now, what flayed alive means is that they tie you up, and basically they skin you, and just tear or cut your skin off while you're still alive. It is very, very painful, and it takes you a long time to die. These people that did that sort of thing were very skilled in how to do that, and it was a horrible thing to see and to experience. And so that was one of the things that they would do as a sign, or as just, telling people, okay, this is what you're going to be, or this is what's going to happen to you if you don't just cease all hostilities and just give up. So the psychological and physical brutality of the Assyrians, it was overwhelming, and it extended to the people that they actually defeated. So whenever there was a rebellion, they met it with overwhelming force, and quickly there was no well, let's do some diplomacy. Nope. If you were rebelling against the Assyrian Empire, then all bets were off, and you were probably going to lose. So um, they would, and they didn't try to win the hearts and minds of people. There was no hearts and mind kind of programs. They would, and sometimes just remove, in some cases, entire populations of a city and just move them, and then that way, okay, then you can't have any resistance if their city was moved, or if basically if their leaders and their royalty and anybody with education and money, if those guys were removed, then the peasants were probably not going to rise up against you. And so they did that. And they say that some scholars today say that the Assyrians removed something like 4.5 million people from their original homelands using this method, and that's 4.5 million over a hundred years of warfare. So, in a time period when might makes right, the Assyrians definitely were the most right of all people. And so their ancestral, that spanned from their ancestral homelands on the north side of the Tigris River, they just left nothing but destruction in their wake all through. And they eventually they collapsed due to combined efforts of other empires and other enemies. And it did, though, leave an indelible mark on history because of their innovative martial culture and the new military tactics that they employed. And so, are there any? And this picture here is a relief of them flaying Hebrews after the capture of Lachish. Okay, here's a map of the Assyrian army empire under Tiglath-pileser, and it even expanded then under his son and subsequent kings on down into the Sinai and into Egypt, and over got into Babylon. And so they mostly the expansion in the other years would be down in the south toward Egypt, but they did totally encompass and surround Israel and Judah. And eventually Judah also became a vassal state of Assyria. So, all right, let's look at these kings. We're going to look at basically just three of them tonight, and one of them would be Jotham. He was the son, you remember, of King Uzziah, who went into the temple to burn incense, which he was not supposed to do, and God struck him with leprosy. So he ended up spending the rest of his life in a separate little house, not in the palace. And his son Jotham was the de facto leader of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem, I guess. And the best I can figure, the times and timelines are kind of hard to figure on these things, that he reigned 16 years after the death of his father. So, and even before that, he had several years of being his father's go-between for all the people. All right, and so it said that he did what was right in the eyes of Adonai, just as his father Uzziah had done. Remember, Uzziah started strong, but he ended up going off the deep end toward paganism. But unlike his father, he did not enter the temple of Adonai, meaning that he didn't overstep his boundaries of trying to be a priest and a king at the same time. Now, here's a sentence that is really it's sad. That Jotham did everything that was right in the sight of God, but said the people, however, acted corruptly, meaning the people, they were still they were sinful people. They were mostly, they just did their thing with worshiping the pagan gods and offering incense and sacrifices in the high places and so forth. They just were not swayed. The pull of the pagan religions was just very, very strong for the Judean people, just like it was for the Israelite people. And there was, in many ways, the problem with that was that there was only one place to worship, and that was in Jerusalem. So the centers of instruction, religious instruction, and so forth, were pretty much centered only in Jerusalem. And so after the Babylonian exile, while they were in the Babylonian exile, the leaders of the Jewish people got together and said, we need to change this. And then that's when the synagogue system came into play. And we'll talk about that in later weeks when we get to that. And that's kind of fascinating in a way, what they did, and some of these guys like Ezra, Nehemiah, and even Daniel participated in some of this thing to try to reorganize Israel into multi-centered or just a lot of different places. Each village, each city had its own synagogue where they could teach the Torah, and they would get together and have worship services there. They would still have to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, but at least they would have a weekly basis for getting together and studying Torah. Okay, so what did Jotham do? He said he rebuilt the upper gate of the house of Adonai and did extensive building on the wall at Ophel. And he also built cities in the Judean hills and forts and towers in the forest. Jotham also fought the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against them. That year, the Ammonites paid him 100 talents of silver and 10,000 measures of wheat and 10,000 of barley. The Ammonites brought him the same amount also in the second and third years. Jotham became powerful because he ordered his ways before Adonai his God. Okay, so the idea that the story of Jotham rebuilding and repairing the temple that's important, because what it did, it showed that it showed his attitude toward worship of God, and that he looked at the worship of God as being very important. So he went, and fixed up the temple and made sure it was in good repair. And then he also was trying to make Judah great again. And so he built forts and towers to watch for when the enemy was coming. And so when he fought, he went to war, he prevailed in war. And why? It was all because he followed God. And so that's a lesson it would have been a lesson for any of those kings. If you just follow God, you're going to be a successful king and ruler. And your nation, Israel or Judah, would have been a successful nation. So, but then we get into Ahaz. And he says he was 20 years old when he became king. We don't know what happened with Jotham, why he died at a fairly young age, maybe in his 40s. But then his son was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the eyes of Adonai, as his father David had done, but followed the ways of the kings of Israel. Those bad guys, the ones that there was not one single godly king of Israel in the whole 200 years from since the death of Solomon until the fall of Israel. Not one of those kings was a godly king. They all were pagan worshipers, idolaters. So anyway, but Ahaz followed the ways of the kings of Israel and even made molten images for the Baalim. And moreover, he burned incense in the valley of Ben Hinnom and burned his children in the fire according to the abominations of the nations whom Adonai had driven out before Bnei Israel. He offered sacrifices and burned incense in the high places, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. And so, okay, under every leafy tree. That again is a it's hyperbole, that the Bible uses sometimes. It's like, yeah, we had a party and everybody showed up. And so, basically what it means is that, yeah, he did a lot of sacrifices and incense and all over the place. All right. So we don't know why Ahaz was evil. I was reading something today. I came up on something that was written for children. It was a Bible story kind of a thing, and their thing was that, well, Uzziah and Jotham and Ahaz. He was evil because his father and his grandfather, his great grandfather, didn't take the time to teach him about God. So it's very important for us to teach, to teach our children about God. Well, there is nothing in the Bible that says that. Okay, we don't know why he was like that. But he abandoned the faith of his father and his grandfather, and he pursued the pagan gods, and he did it with a passion. And the worst thing that he did was to burn his children or sacrifice his children to the god Moloch. All right, now that was definitely a Canaanite thing, that they would take their firstborn or whatever, and they would hand it over, and it really doesn't show well here. And I tried to find a picture of it that would go, but see, you look here, and you've got these guys pouring wood into this furnace, and basically this whole thing was just lit up red hot, and it would have basically what it would have a catchment down here and a hole right in here, and they would take these babies and put them in the arms of this thing and just roll them into the fire alive. They did that. They put their babies in the fire alive. And so, can you just imagine what the horror of some of that? And so it's it to me, it's kind of similar to today, where they inject this strong saline, battery acid saline, into the womb, and kill the babies in these abortions today. They said, well, the babies don't feel anything. Well, they do, because you can watch the ultrasounds and watch these babies trying to squirm and get away from all of that. And so, to me, that's a modern day Moloch, is the Planned Parenthood and that sort of thing. So, um, if I'm not going to go, I'm not going to go any further than that, because if I do, I'll get to preaching instead of teaching, and then um, I get kind of passionate on the idea of killing babies. So anyway, any comments or questions so far? The king, then King Rezin of Aram, and Pekah, the son of King Remaliah of Israel, marched against Jerusalem to wage war. They besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, King Rezin of Aram recovered Elath for Aram and Aram, and drove the Jews out of Elath. And then the Edomites, they came to Elath and settled there to this day. All right, Elath is down on the Red Sea. That was the seaport for Judah to be able to sail out of there, and it was very important for them for the trade. And so they when the king of Israel and the king of Aram there in Damascus, they got together. They were going to go against Judah, and I don't know what their purpose was at that particular time. Why they got a burr under their saddle about going against Judah, but they did. And now they were not able to take Jerusalem. The Jerusalem was a very hard city to besiege because they had a good water supply, so you couldn't drive them out by being thirsty, and they generally had a good food supply stored up in there, so they could last for years, and could pretty much break a siege. And so they went ahead and captured the seaport of Elath. Now that would have been an economic blow to the kingdom of Judah. And so we then, and I'm kind of jumping around between Chronicles and Kings because I'm trying to stay in a chronological order here as to how some of this stuff happened at the same time that that Israel and Aram were going against Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, they couldn't really take Jerusalem, but said what they really inflicted heavy casualties on Judah. And so we'll read this part here. It's in one day, Pekah, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 valiant soldiers of Judah because they had forsaken Adonai, the God of their fathers. Also, Zechariah, a warrior from Ephraim, killed Maaseiah, the king's son, Azrikam, the official in charge of the palace, and Elkanah, the second to the king. Men of Israel carried away captive 200,000 of their kinsmen, women, sons, and daughters, and they took away a great deal of plunder from them that they brought to Samaria. All right, so even though they couldn't take Jerusalem, they went around the surrounding cities around there and basically acted like a invading foreign army and took their own kinsmen, basically their own countrymen, their cousins, basically, and they took them and captured them, and they killed 120 of the Judean soldiers. And so the Bible says, though, that, okay, how could they do that? Well, guess what? Judah wasn't, they killed these guys, and they went against the Judean people. This is because they had forsaken Adonai, the God of their fathers. They had given up. The Torah clearly says you don't go against your own people. You don't even loan them money with interest. That's what the Torah says. And so to go in war against Israel, against Judah, Israel going against Judah, that was in direct violation of Torah. And this is because they had forsaken Adonai. And so at this point now, you could also look at this because this was King Ahaz, and he was leading the people in the wrong direction. Well, it could be that the soldiers of Judah had forsaken Adonai. It's a little bit, you can read it either way in the Hebrew, that they lost 120,000 people because they also were not serving God. And so both sides were at fault at this. So then, though, in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 28, 9 through 15, there's that whole thing there is about a prophet named Oded, who went out there and he went to meet the army on its return to Samaria. He said to them, behold, because Adonai, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he has given them into your hand, and you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. So now you intend to bring into bondage the children of Judah and Jerusalem as your male and female slaves. Are you not also guilty of transgressions against Adonai your God? So now listen to me. Send back the prisoners you have captured from your kinsmen, for the fierce wrath of Adonai is upon you. Then some of the leaders of the sons of Ephraim, Azariah, son of Jehohanan, Berechiah, son of, all of those sons, a lot of hard names, okay, confronted those coming from the campaign and said to them, do not bring the captives in here, for that would cause us to trespass against Adonai. do you intend to add to your sin, to our sins and our guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger is already against Israel. So the soldiers released the captives and the plunder in the presence of the chieftains and the entire congregation. Then the men designated by name stood up and took the captives. They clothed all who were naked from the plunder. They gave them clothes and sandals, food, drink, anointed them, meaning they took care of them and cleaned them up, and led all of the feeble ones on donkeys and brought them back to their kinsmen at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then they returned to Samaria. So Israel really avoided. Of course, it was just a short-lived thing. They still got theirs in the end shortly thereafter. But the very idea of them taking their own kinsmen from Judea would have been terrible. So this was about the same time then that Ahaz was being attacked by Israel, and so then he went and he sent off to Damascus, and not to Damascus, to the Assyrians, and said, "Hey, look, if you will come and fight for us, I'll give you lots of money, and then you go against Israel and against Aram." And so that's what they ended up doing. The king of Assyria responded, and he marched up against Damascus, captured it, deported its inhabitants as captives to Kir, and put Rezin to death. So the king of Judah was successful in getting the the Assyrians to come in, but that was the deal with the devil, because at this point then Ahaz would have been a vassal of the Assyrians, and he paid Tiglath-pileser with gold and silver from the temple. I mean, he just took all that out of the temple, and then all the money out of the treasury. How many times had that happened? They would do that, then they would have a period of prosperity, so they could renew all the gold and silver, I guess, and then the king would come along and decide, okay, I'm giving it all away to this other king or something, so that he won't hurt me. And so different times, same kind of story we see in today's world, where the government comes and decides that, well, you don't need your money. We're going to take your money and we're going to give it to somebody over here that doesn't work or is not even a U.S. citizen. And okay, that's politics. We got to go on. So then King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-pileser of Assyria, and saw the altar that was at Damascus. So King Ahaz went to Uriah, the Kohen that's back in Jerusalem, and he sent him the pattern for that altar and a little model of it, so that he could construct one for him. He liked that altar, and so Uriah, then the Kohen, built an altar according to what the king Ahaz had sent from Damascus, and Uriah the Kohen finished it by the time King Ahaz returned from Damascus. When the king came back from Damascus, saw the altar, the king approached the altar and went up to it. Then he burned his burnt offering, his grain offering, and poured his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his fellowship offerings on the altar. So here's a guy that he's been defeated by the Assyrians. Basically, he's now one of their servants, because he had asked them to come in and kill or go against Israel and Damascus. And so that made him very much beholden to the king of Assyria. And so here he is now. He sees that Well, because their gods were more important or more powerful than our God, then I'm going to sacrifice to their God, the Assyrian gods, rather than to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm even going to use one of their altars, their type of altar, whatever that looked like. We don't know to this day what that altar may have looked like, but it was certainly something that impressed him enough that he wanted to get rid of the other altars, and so the altar that was authorized in the temple. And so the high priest, which he complied. He was not like the high priest during the time of Uzziah, where he stood in the gap and said, "No, king, you're not going to offer incense in the temple," and he was justified in that, and God struck Uzziah with leprosy. Well, this high priest said, "Yeah, okay, whatever the king wants, that's okay with me." And so he burned all of these offerings. Well, can you imagine what God thought about that? Okay, well, yeah, it did not end well for him. For him. So then we jump from there, keeping in chronological order. And does anyone have any comments or questions while I get a drink? All right, I've got my drink now. All right, so in the 12th year of the king Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became the king in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria marched against him, so Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea conspiring, and he had sent because he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt, and had not paid the tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done every year. Therefore, the king of Assyria seized him and put him in prison. All right, so this guy Hoshea, uh, he's the last guy. He was the last king of Israel, and the Bible says that he was bad, but he wasn't as bad as the kings that were before him. Um, and I when I first looked at that, I said, well, he did evil. He did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. And to me, I looked at that and said, okay, here's the king that's going to be evil, and he's going to be one that says, okay, you think those other guys were evil? Hold my beer and watch this. And so, but the commentators that I read said, no, he was evil, but maybe he just wasn't as evil as some of the other kings that were ahead of him, and maybe so. I don't know, but anyway, he became a vassal to Assyria because they had just they'd come in there and just surrounded. And what else was he going to do? He was going to say, "Yeah, I'll pay the tribute." And rather than be conquered and flayed alive, that flayed alive part is not a lot of fun. So yeah, we'll pay the price. And so they did that. But then he got caught uh, trying to conspire with the king of Egypt to come up and fight against Shalmaneser. But the problem with that was that Egypt was involved in its own civil war. Egypt was split into just a whole series of city states at that point. They didn't have an overarching pharaoh that was going to, an all that guy that was in charge of all of Egypt. It was had broken down into just regions, and so you had somebody in Thebes, and you had somebody in wherever the various places were in Egypt, and each one of them held sway over that territory, but not one of them was strong enough then to uh, field an army that would go and fight anybody. They were just trying to hang on themselves to what was going on in Egypt. So perhaps Ahaz misread the whole thing down there in Egypt, and thought that he was going to get some help from them, but he bet on the wrong horse in this case. So the Assyrians came in, seized him, and put him in prison. And that's probably meant they hauled him back off to Assyria. And then the king of Assyria invaded all of Samaria, and he marched up to it and besieged it for 3 years. And so in the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Syria, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He placed them in Halah, Habor, on the Gozan River, and in the towns of the Medes. So the Assyrian, the Assyrian records that we have, where they wrote down the stuff, said that they had taken 27,280 Israelites, people from Israel, and carried them off into captivity. The rest of them stayed behind. Now, there is a lot of different opinions on that, because they said, oh no, the Syrians came in and they wiped out all of Israel. They took every man, beast, and everything all out of Israel and left it a ghost town. And so the idea that there would probably have been at that time a couple of million, 2 or 3 million people in Israel, just according to how many people they had as soldiers in their armies. And so there could have easily been several million people in Israel. And that idea of taking them from Samaria all the way up into what we now know is Turkey and all that, a couple of million people, to me, that's a little bit incredible. I think the record of saying, yeah, they took out 27,280 is a little bit more reasonable, because that they would have taken out any kind of people that claimed a royalty, any kind of soldiers, generals, officers, any of the government officials, anybody that could mount any kind of resistance against Assyria. They would have taken them out. Any of the wealthy people, who then they could soak them for, okay, yeah, I'll keep you alive if you'll send us some money from your farms down there, or whatever. And so the remainder of them stayed behind. That's the way I look at it. I've read some estimates where they said that the people taken out of Israel were only about 5 to 7% of the total population, not the entire thing. And so this idea of the lost tribes of Israel is, in my opinion, kind of bogus. Second Chronicles, Second Chronicles 34:9 indicates, this was after the Babylonian exile was done, and they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and so forth. That they talk about how that the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh and those in Israel, the remnant of Israel, contributed a certain amount to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So that the way that the wording there is that there were still a lot of people from that era, from Israel and from that area and era, that they were still there. And so what happened then is that the Assyrians then, which was their practice, they took and brought people down into Samaria, and they became the leaders in Samaria. And as such, then they assimilated with the Samaritans. And then there were, they said they had problems with lions coming in and killing. So the Assyrians just said, wait a minute, that's because their God is not happy. So let's send some of their priests down there to teach us what we're supposed to do with their God, and then maybe the lions won't be so bad. And so that's what they did. But then the priests got corrupted, and it was all assimilated. So they took a little bit of the Assyrian religion, and then a little bit of the Jewish Israelite religion, and melded them together. And even certainly by the time of Yeshua, that was a mix, an assimilation, and the people of Jerusalem and Judea and that area down there, all the rest of the nation of Israel, looked at the Samaritans as half breeds and not even human, because certainly they weren't Jewish, and so that's why you had the problems, the prejudice against the Samaritans. And it all stemmed from this time frame here where they assimilated with the Assyrians. All right. And so then we see in 2 Kings 17, 7 to 23, here's a listing. The writer of 2 Kings made a list of, okay, this is why Israel was taken out, and he is almost kind of like a justification of why did God let this happen? Well, God didn't let it happen; He caused it to happen, and so this is one of his. He kind of enumerated all of these things in verses 7 to 23, and I just hit 4 or 5 of them here. As a reason why God did this, and there's a lot more, and that some of them they kind of repeat themselves, but their ingratitude and failure to appreciate all God did for them. They adopted the idolatry of Canaan. I mean, they set up pillars and Asherah poles and did the incense and sacrifices, and and then they ignored what the prophets were trying to tell them. This was Jeremiah and Isaiah and Hosea and some of the other prophets trying to tell them, get back to God, and they wouldn't do it. They ignored him. They transgressed Torah. And the worst thing that they did was then they caused their children to walk through the fire, meaning that they threw their babies into a burning fire alive as a sacrifice to Moloch. And so, that's a good reason to overthrow the country and send them all packing. And that's pretty much what they did, what happened with them. So, okay, I have run out of time now, and I have run out of slides, I think. Yep, run out of slides.